that's an academic event, and probably the first one for the game artists especially. So we have 3 speakers today. They are all super experienced guys. And then later we would like to discuss with you what events you would like to have in the future and what needs artists have here in Tallinn, in Estonia. And the whole idea about those events is to unite game artists and finally provide them like special event. So there are a lot of plans. We would like to invite also some cool artists from abroad to have workshops and lectures here as well in Tallinn. But we need to understand exactly what you would like to see here and your wishes as well. But our first speaker is Kaspar. Kaspar, please.
Can you see from there that my ears are bright red? They feel super hot. And because of an intense fear of public speaking that approaches Lovecraftian terror, I'm going to be reading a good portion of my talk off of these pages, including this sentence. So, my name is Kaspar Tamsalu, and I'm an artist. I transitioned from fine art to Gamedev just over 2 years ago, when I was hired as a concept artist by Elysium studio to work on the role-playing game Truce for the Furies. Before that, I lived in St. Petersburg in Russia for 5 years. I studied academical painting and constructed figure drawing. Soon after, I moved back to Estonia and finished my master's degree in the Estonian Academy of Arts with 2 diplomas and no real idea of how to proceed. That was the summer of 2015, a little over 2 years ago. Enter Zaum into the picture. Zaum Studio, or simply Zaum, is a fairly young and a fairly small video game studio based here in Tallinn. For the last year, the employee headcount fluctuates around the number 25. It was started in 2015 and was initially named Fortress Occident. You might still get some links to our dev blog with fortressoccident.com, I guess. The game was called something else as well. Zoom as a whole has a longer history, and if you Google Robert Kurvitz and look up his Wikipedia page, you can find out more about it. By the time I got on board, a skeleton crew of artists and writers had spent around 6 months doing pre-production for the game that would become the Truce with the Furies project. I was hired as a concept artist to work on level design, specifically. In retrospect, I was wholly unequipped for such a task because I had only been drawing naked people and moth-eaten drapery for years and years. Recently, we looked at some of that early work I did, and it is a little embarrassing. Luckily, we've all learned a lot, and our skills and our confidence in said skills has grown a ton since then. During that whole time, almost 3 years now, we've been working on our debut video game project, Truce with the Furies. It is a police-themed isometric role-playing game where you play a more or less psychotic detective in and around of the coastal town Martinez, itself a district of a much larger city of Revachol. Before I talk more about that and get into the nitty-gritty of making art for this one, I'd like to talk more generally about the genre. Isometric video games have been developed since the 80s. Those that look a little like a board game. Role-playing games, isometric ones, have always been a small niche. A lot of those other games involved building cities or demolishing those cities with heavy artillery and tanks. And if you're interested in more detail of video game history, you'll get a better overview when you Google isometric games. Wikipedia has an article on the subject and gives you a cursory overview, while if you dig in various gaming forum archives, you can get more in-depth conversations and a shit ton of opinions. For me personally, the isometric aesthetic has its roots in the early Zelda and Final Fantasy games that were made for consoles. Can you see that? Oh, I can't see the cursor. This one's Zelda, this one's Final Fantasy, and this one's Chrono Trigger. I never got to play those on a console though. I stumbled on those in my teens when I discovered virtual emulators and online databases of game ROMs. Chrono Trigger comes to mind, although I think I clocked most hours playing Final Fantasy. My immediate inspiration for designing an isometric video game are the first two Fallout games. Their gritty and realistic, beautiful sprite-based art and the then unique plots unfolding in an open-world sandbox devoured my early teenage summers. There's no way we can get around any of the Infinity Engine games like Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and Icewind Dale 1 and 2, and Planescape Torment. So this one is Fallout. This is Baldur's Gate, and here we have Icewind Dale and Planescape Torment respectively. These have cemented tens of thousands of role-playing geeks and grognards' expectations of what a true role-playing video game has to look and play like. And let me now explain why we're making a game that looks the way it does. I want to interject that if you have any questions during the thing, then just make some noise and interrupt me. Why isometric? The isometric projection is a form of axonometric projection. In 3D, you can use perspective where all lines converge to certain points depending on where the viewer is standing, or you can use parallel projection, where the z, or height axis, always points up. This is essential for games that use pre-rendered backgrounds like ours. Otherwise, when the camera moves, the perspective would change, and that interferes with our plans for the aesthetic look we want to have in our game. Isometry also has a long and interesting history in art, as opposed to the Western linear perspective. Here's a Fra Angelico from the 16th century. The Western linear perspective is based on Euclidean optics. The isometry is also incorrectly known as Chinese perspective. And here's an example of a famous 11-meter scroll painting, A City of Cathay, done in the 18th century by artists of the King Court. This is just a fragment. The whole thing is way longer, and it covers waterways and roads and bridges and a huge city. So this is all a form of axonometric projection. You can also recognize weird applications of axonometry in various Byzantine religious icons and frescoes that depict cities, crusades, and invasions. So we could say that we're joining our game to those traditions. So why pre-render? My first note to answer this was a retarded exclamation in all capitals that read, "the pretties." It may sound stupid, but it's fully correct. It allows us to do some very nice aesthetic decisions. One of those includes the fine art of painting, so maybe that diploma of mine isn't so useless after all. Pre-rendering the backgrounds also allows us to put more detail into our backgrounds. It also gives us more control of distributing and manipulating that detail. It might actually become possible with real-time 3D in the coming years, but when we set off designing this game a few years ago, pre-rendering was the only option to get the look we wanted. Historically, a lot of isometric games have been tile-based. Early on, isometric projection was a cheap way of taking a three-dimensional look. But if you played any of the original Fallout games, you might remember the awkward zigzag run of the Vault Dweller and Chosen One. The character would move like this. And this came with the game engine's limitations, where navigation was restricted to a hexagonal grid that meshed well with the chosen axonometric projection formulae. Also, the angles for buildings and other elements in the environment were restricted to these grids. We don't have that issue, because we are combining pre-rendered backgrounds with real-time 3D characters and game objects in a wholly 3D game engine. We use Unity, and we can use Unity's nav mesh for navigation and basically make game levels of whatever shape and size we want. The classic interior maps with black void around them is very flexible here. Games like Playdead's Limbo and Inside, which was published, I think, last year, have been a great inspiration for me with their use of, oh, this one's the detail one, okay. With their use of black silhouettes in the foreground and then the content in the background. This is a screenshot from our game to show off the level of detail we can put into a pre-rendered background.
It's like an actual screenshot from the game.
I think so. Was this an actual screenshot? Yeah. We have some fake ones, but this one's an actual one. So there are, in the game there's an overlay where certain items can be interacted with. And we have a hidden geometry hidden inside, so we can use dynamic lighting that shows and catches light, throws shadows and catches light, and like outlines and certain active elements where you can interact with the elements in the game. So, for example, this pig's head, it would have an outline, and when you click on it, you would get the descriptions that's here. And certain objects are interactable. So you click on it and then something else happens, or an area transition or something like that. Fairly common in games like these. And as I said, the black outline of the interior maps, this is when you go inside, outside, everywhere, you have this black. And in the foreground, we can use it as silhouettes. The screenshot cuts it off, but basically here, like silhouettes of objects you can recognize. Similarly as here, where you have like boxes and things that help develop the thing. Now I'll explain how it works for our game. The background asset creation process is a long one. First we get a writer's draft. Then I draw up the concept designs, where I sometimes use 3D blockings. For that I use Blender. It's open source, and the first thing that I learned how to use. Then it goes into modeling, where all the details are shaped. Landscapes get sculpted in ZBrush or Blender, and then we look it over and might have to tweak things here and there. The next step is to texture everything and optimize it for rendering. We used to spend long hours messing with bump maps and various wood and rock textures, both manually making the textures ourselves from photographs, or in Quixel and other programs that allow procedural texturing. At one point we discovered that bump maps interfere with the painting stage, and now we just give all the objects a diffuse color before rendering. I'll talk about what the painting stage is in a bit. We render the backgrounds in 4K resolution with Blender. We use a custom render written by our technical artist and resident shader wizard. That render splits out a whole array of different maps. I'm going to get a little technical for a moment, and like all the pussy in the movie From Dusk Till Dawn, we have a whole bunch of maps. We use height maps, normal maps, specularity maps, light field maps for in-engine lighting, and shadow maps for each separate time of day. There's also the very pretty painted map with most of the color information. So this is a height map that you see here for an interior area. The height map allows the game engine to calculate where light falls and which objects are closer to the camera and which objects are farther away. For example, this one tells the engine whether the character is standing behind the generic sci-fi crate or in front of it. And normal maps tell the engine which way the objects, this one's a normal map, which way the objects and their various faces are looking. This is also necessary for lighting. As a side note, I think we've talked about it before and discussed it in our dev blog. Check out our website. Normal maps are more interesting for our characters and more organic in-game assets because we paint them by hand to better mesh with the expressive brushstrokes in the game backgrounds. Specularity maps tell the engine which surfaces reflect more or less light. You can skip it this one. And light field maps are a custom thing that works with our shaders. With this, the characters and real-time objects are lit from different angles and with varying intensity on the interior backgrounds. As opposed to the exterior backgrounds where shadows and lights are governed by the ominous-sounding shadow maps, which is a map that has separate shadow information for different times of day written into a single channel. So RGB gives us shadows for morning, midday, and evening lights, respectively. This was the shadow map, where we have the light information. And this is the painted map, which is handcrafted. So the renderer shoots out this one, and then our art director Rostov takes the render background with all the diffuse color information, and then paints over it in Photoshop. This is where a lot of the visual magic happens. I'm a fan of art direction for the Dishonored games, and they've supposedly also gone for a painterly look. In various articles and interviews, they've detailed how they paint the textures by hand. But having the game world as a two-dimensional image allows us to do certain things with texture that doesn't translate well into first-person or even third-person perspective. So we take all these different maps and we attach them to a flat plane in Unity, and the shader magic does the rest. We can add to this cool weather effects like snow and rain, and dynamic lighting either as environmental light sources from street lamps or cars, and where a torch in a character's hand moves around and pointing at the game world. With isometric projection in a game, we have a bunch of issues. And as the title suggests, we run into several issues working this way. I'll detail a few of those and offer solutions that seem to work for us. Now I'm going to get closer to the design part of this talk. First of all, we have memory consumption. As I said before, we render the background textures in 4K resolution. What I did not tell you is that the exterior world of Martinez, the streets and waterfronts and beaches, are all on a single huge world map, which you can access almost immediately after you begin the game. So here's a slightly outdated sketch of the whole game world. I've blurred it further so that it wouldn't spoil anything for those of you who want to have fun exploring it when the game launches sometime next year. That huge map consists of 4K resolution squares, and the memory issue was solved by using megatextures, which was, I think, originally developed for games like Rage, and there's a plugin called Virtual Textures for Unity. I cannot really explain how this works, so that might become a separate article on our dev blog one day, written up by Seam, our shader magician. But in short, we stream texture data in smaller chunks where necessary so that it doesn't hog up memory as much. So when the character will be moving around in this part wouldn't be loaded. And as the character progresses through the map, textures will be streamed where necessary. Then we have the issue of perceived height. In a true isometric projection, the x, y, and z axes have the same metric. What this means is that when we render a cube, say, with a side of 2 meters, all the edges on the screen will be as long, the vertical ones and the ones on the sides. And when we set two of those cubes close together, there is no easy way to discern by eye which one is positioned higher or lower in space or whether they are level. There is no easy solution, but essentially lighting is key. You can bring out or push back elements with light and shadow. Also tonal noise, the sizes of light and dark shapes around these objects. And chroma, intensity of color of these objects. You can also add recognizable visual cues like stairs and ladders that tell the player that there's a change in height. In-engine particle effects like fog or smoke can be upheld here as well. I'll go back a few. Like here, for example, like as everything is in parallel perspective, there is no difference between this and this area. So I could take the character and plop him up here, and the only thing that would tell us that the character is up there is that he'd be not in direct light that comes from here, and we see a ladder here, so the player sort of can deduce that there is a height difference. Same thing happens here, where if a character stands here or up here, the only thing that informs us that there's a level change is the graphics, basically. Another one is that because of parallel projection, we cannot show you the sky, because the sky never shows up. It's a continuous, huge world map. So the only solution is to show sky reflected in water, like puddles and seawater, or as shadows of clouds and aliens on the ground and buildings. This is all that happens in Unity in real time with lighting and with particle effects. Another problem we hit was daytime shadows. When we tried using real-world directions, then you get a very nice moody morning shadow, and a similar nice shadow for the evening, but from the opposite side. The midday light washed out all the shadows, because it comes from the direction of the player and camera, south. So morning shadows would be coming from this side, and the evening shadows would be coming from this side, but daylight shadow would be like a spotlight straight into the buildings, and that would wash out all the detail and make the images basically bland. So our solution, and actually the solution for other similar games, was to redirect daytime shadows so that they fall from the north instead, toward the camera. So all the light falls from behind the buildings, and certain objects catch more light, and there is more shadow to make the world feel voluminous. I'm gonna show you now 2 short videos to help illustrate the topics I'm covering. They're both up on our website, and one shows a night scene, and the other one is a short clip of how you play the game with voiceovers by yours truly. This is one of the central areas from the beginning of the game.
The linden-headed machine of
Here you can see shadows move.
dignified suffering is firing.
Or
Have
the
shadows
shadows.
baked in the light maps? No?
We call them shadow maps, but basically, yeah.
It wants to roam the desert,
They are not dynamic.
hurting,
They are like baked.
longing,
In
dancing to
shadows that fall
despair.
from buildings, for example, like the huge one from the
Okay, so building shadows are in the light map, and from
Yeah,
dynamic
well,
objects are like
character
real-time shadows.
character shadows. Come on, shadows. This? Yeah. So these shadows that we see from here that fall from the buildings, and these are all baked into this is the morning light, because it comes from this side. These are in the shadow maps. So we have a similar thing in another channel for the evening shadows, where all of this is in shadow. And what we did for the daylight maps was we had the light come from up there so that shadows would fall like here. And you would have areas that are in light and areas that are in shadow. But when I was talking about the issue with the daylight, there was a spotlight from the camera at these buildings, and it's like those passport photos you get, but it doesn't really show you anything. And the game world looked like, it had a lot of detail and a lot of interesting small things here, like you can zoom in and zoom out, and at different zoom levels there are points of interest, but when you put a spotlight on it, everything looks like sort of the same. And because of the height issues where you put 2 isometric objects next to each other, you cannot see, like, the characters up here and the characters down here are the same size, there's no perspective. So with everything lit with the same light, you just don't see the difference between the height levels.
And currently, when the lighting is changing, you can play button again. So the characters, they receive dynamic shadows which literally move, but building shadows are just blended to light map.
There's 2 things actually. Here, this shadow here, we have hidden geometry inside certain objects, which is super low poly. It's basically like just a rectangle
For shadows.
Yeah, this is for the dynamic shadows in the game. So we have the big ones, like this one.
So big ones are just blended together, 2 textures.
Actually, I'm getting this wrong, aren't I? Because this is also from the block.
Just
taken the painting shadow is still and the other shadow.
put play button, like, it will be
Yeah,
visible.
yeah.
Yeah, just blend it, it's not moving.
Yeah, so this one is in the shadow map, and these are from the
Mhm.
logins and from in-engine objects. Like the car is an engine pulley, and these views.
And there's
Okay, and the other one I wanted to show you is this one.
Hello, in the short alpha gameplay video, we are taking a walk through Science Research with our Truce department.
This was streamed on Twitch, I think. Hack
Specifically conceptualization, which is the character's
And here we show
original thought.
basically what gameplay is like, how you interact with the world. But why I'm showing this is because if you zoom out, it's this huge. If you zoom out, it's this huge map, but the player can zoom in and out of this. So what I call this is the screen space. So this moves around, and at every point where the character is positioned, you have to have something interesting or something intriguing, like an interesting composition or some interesting textures. And this is basically a meta joke because this wall has like awesome painterly textures, and the player can literally interact with that. If you've seen this before, or you want to look it up on YouTube, there's this whole art cop sort of side quest that you can do. So at every point when I freeze the screen, there has to be something that's going on in the thing. If I zoom out, or if I zoom in.
Let's give ourselves a quest or task, and this is something that is fairly common in no
If something interesting leads immediately, something interesting has to return from some other direction, so that the player would have fun exploring the level.
unique ways.
And here we can see how light helps define the different height levels. Like with big shadows from other objects, or like from the ship over here, and with visual cues like an actual staircase, we know that this is higher and this is lower, even though in reality it's a two-dimensional image.
Covering different facets of the world.
so like planned out those points of interest.
Dialogue options. A slice of lovingly
It
concept.
actually comes sort of
Previously shown
gradually.
Yeah.
artistic
because as I'm drawing it, sometimes I start with a block in. Like this area actually had like parts of that building up there that we use elsewhere, and then I just started demolishing it basically.
Right, together
And
with this task of finding some paint, we're going to have a chapter.
I'll get back to this, I guess.
Do you use light probes for character lighting?
What's that for?
Light probe. How those light maps which you use
Yes.
on the ground, how does it reach the character when it's walking through the light map shadow?
Height map, yes. The height map,
No, that's the character is also receives the shadow from the invisible geometry that's inside the building as well.
So all buildings have the invisible geometry, so
Yeah.
everything.
Very basic.
Okay, not only some posts, okay, everything. Okay.
It's good to have better informed people in the audience.
So all buildings, even invisible buildings, are really rendering all the dynamic shadows
Yes.
real time, in addition to the light map. Okay.
Yeah.
But you only cast shadows on the characters.
Okay.
Why did you use different times of day? Did it come from the story that you visit the same places on different times during the day, or is it just cooler?
Well, one of the things is just cooler, but it also allows us to indicate to the player that the time of day is different. So if you walk out of a room in the morning, light would be one way. Yeah, we can do it with color overlays, so that in the morning it's slightly colder, during daytime it's super hot, it's like, I don't know, brighter yellow, in the evening it's orange. But with the shadows, it has so much more effect. And one of the reasons also is like it's a selling point because nobody else is doing it like that.
Oh.
Like we have Pillars of Eternity, we have the new Torment game, and they use shadows are always coming from the same direction. In bad cases, the shadows of objects are falling one way and the character shadows are going the other way.
Yeah.
So we try to avoid that and try to keep everything coherent.
Okay, yeah, I'm just thinking maybe if you use one constant time, you would always choose the coolest shadows.
Well, that's what we did with the daylight shadows right now.
Okay.
Like this is why we're re-rendering the whole exterior map that we already have ready or have already done because it just looked bland. It wasn't good looking enough. So we always, while designing it, has to be practical. It has to serve the narrative purposes, and also it has to be aesthetically pleasing. And we have like certain things that we want to do art-wise. I'll keep talking and get back to some questions soon. Slideshow with some pictures. So I just talked a little bit about the screen space, and I'll get to the hexagon as well. So the screen space is where in the video what is shown inside the screen, the rest of the world is outside, but it keeps moving around. So something interesting has always have to be in that picture that the player sees. So game levels should not be simply a background for a standalone narrative. When level design is done right, the narrative flows between substrates, text and sound and visual art, like in a finely woven fabric. So when the image is moving on the screen, independent of the zoom level, something interesting should always be in sight. This is true in other art forms as well. Think about Tarkovsky's films, where he uses formal composition to guide the viewer's eye around in a scene, or the finely textured, monumentally huge paintings by Anselm Kiefer, where you can like go really into the thing and enjoy certain textures and shapes in the painting, or you can step back and then see that it's a huge hangar for airplanes, or it's a huge field. So whether you step close, it has to be interesting, or you step back, zoom in or zoom out, it has to capture the player's interest. I'm repeating myself here. So yeah, at any point the player must not get bored with anything they see. This was done very well in the game Divinity Original Sin, which just got a sequel like last month or a few months ago. Wherever you go, even off the beaten path, like there are paths that the game wants you to take, like go there, do that, but you can go off into the bush and look at weird animals or something, and there's always something interesting to inspect or to look at, or a side quest you can try and solve. And the hexagon that I mentioned here, this is not immediately apparent when looking at the map up close, but when you zoom out, areas tend to follow a hexagonal ground plan. This was unintentional during the early design phase because I've used my past experience with formal composition for drawing objects and architecture, but it makes sense because it is optimal for isometry. So, if we would lose the three edges here, we would get this hexagonal shape. And if this image had some more resolution, that it doesn't, we would see that we can divide the game into these hexagonal shapes with the point of interest in the center, and on the edges. In the front, like if we take this one here, for example, in the front we have the silhouettes of the buildings that cut into that shape, and in the background we have points of interest, like in the center here, in the background, with texture that you can see. Are they moving around here? The more people come. Okay. So the bottom three sides of the hexagon can be used for silhouetting objects. These ones. And the top three can be used for true wall space, because these can be seen when the player looks at the game world. So tools of the trade while designing the game. Number one is composition. That governs basically everything. That's also how I think about placing the objects. Like you ask how I plan ahead, where some points of interest are. This happens naturally while I place objects, and there's a lot of iteration. There's the early concept art, then we do revisions with writers and other artists in the team. And we move things around until we get the rhythm right. There are some areas where a character doesn't have to stay long. So this is an empty space where I can walk through like this. But in another one, where maybe the music is more moody and the lighting is more dramatic, we would have a lot of objects in the ground and you would have to walk around like this, which also governs time in an isometric game, because you spend walking a lot and you're inside the same screen space, but you spend more time there. It's the same happens with comics, where the more panels you have, the more time it takes, sort of, because the empty space between panels signifies time. So we can do that same thing by governing time with the density of objects placed into the game world. So composing the screen space by alternating rhythms of placed objects, clumping together and clustering similar objects and placing them and pacing them to influence players' progression through a level. The speed of exploration influences the setting's mood as well, whether they can run across an open space with ease during daytime or navigate a cramped space inside a dark interior. The silhouettes of room architecture and the objects placed inside it will affect the feel of the level significantly. Then there's the concept of environmental storytelling. It makes a huge difference whether there's a knife simply placed on a table, or whether it is stuck into the table, or maybe even into the wall in an unlikely place. Attention to detail like this can tell the player something about the characters that inhabit such an environment, even when the story might not address that issue. Together with the plot, the environment presents the player with a coherent whole. And lighting is a very important tool that we already talked about a bunch. So this is one of the screenshots up on our website. And composition of objects, what I mean by that is how big and small objects are placed inside that space. So we have these smaller architectural shapes in the center so that they would not occlude like navigable areas where the character can go back here. And the bigger ones are up here where they're don't do that. Like you get silhouettes from the objects, and if we did not include these, this would be just a flat plane. So at every point, that's why I was talking about the hexagonal. We can look at it like that. In here, there's like a small hexagonal, and the more you zoom in, always that hexagonal sort of governs the amount of details and where the character and where the eye can move.
So is the camera moving with the character, or is it like one space and then you move to the other?
That's a good question. Because, no, it's a good question because I think we're between two things. Right now the camera is tied to the character. During the debugging phase, we always unhook it to look around because it's really annoying to just move around with the character. And I guess it depends on how we end up polishing off sort of controls for navigation, whether it's just going to be point and click or it's something more complex. And also maybe controller support, or how is it going to look on an iPad. And all of this is going to influence how we can tie these things together. There's also the issue of streaming those assets. Like if the character can move around the camera real fast, this is going to affect performance and frame rates. And Yeah, so I guess we're going to stick with fixed camera.
Yeah, because if you let's move the camera, then this front plane would like come to you, and it has to continue. And maybe it's lower silhouette, like when the character is moving.
What do you mean it doesn't continue?
Like when it's moving down, these aren't all like continuous. They are not like props silhouettes, but they're continuous.
Oh yeah, continuous objects. Like it's a huge. Like that's why I showed that world map area. This is an exterior area, like inside the courtyard. But if we would zoom out in the game, which you can do in debug mode if you know the secret codes, then you can see the whole game world. Basically, everything is like painted and lit, and your computer would scream that frame rate is 0. Basically, so all the exterior maps are this one huge area that is continuous. The only thing that chops it up is the mega texture system that streams data. So if you could zoom out beyond your limit, then yeah, you would see more. So with lighting, we one direction. Where did you go? I lost my thing. That's right. Sure about this, technical issues?
Too many desktops.
Probably. Okay, I'll check like this. Full screen. Just added the desktop. So in the concepting phase, and I assume during painting phase, Rostov uses this as well. As with light, you can use more dramatic or less dramatic light to influence how an environment feels like. Does it feel, I don't know, depressing, or is it a happy place you go to when you go back? Another thing is color. And for that, what we use often while prototyping is the newer versions of Photoshop have a gradient map layer adjustment feature. And here are 2 different gradients where you basically, you can take a black and white object, so you can have like a super rough concept sketch and just try out different colors on the thing. And yeah, I don't know where I wanted to go with this. But I think we reached the point that's questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
I've actually played the, what do we call it, a demo? So yeah, I played actually 40 minutes of the game during Gamescom.
Okay.
And what really sold the game to me personally was the level of detail. My question is, like, where did you get the inspiration to fill that world with, you know, big and tiny objects? Because you had to come up with it somehow.
I mean, there are places in the game and places in Old Town where we work that are very similar. Mostly because when we go out to lunch to a restaurant and we had like a diner area inside the game, then I would look up and down and see what kind of weird objects are placed. Because during construction and during reconstruction, people just, everything's not clean. There's always some kind of random noise going on, like old electrical wires or something like that is there. So I try to incorporate that into the background as well. And inside this isometric space, actually inside any kind of image, the lighting is key. I've said lighting, color lighting a lot of times today. And for that, I always try to include things like this and wires and things that make sense. Like if you look up there, the corner is curved like that. It takes light differently. And in different environments, we use sort of different elements that capture and throw shadows and lights differently.
So you basically walk around and you look for examples in your like everyday life and go, oh, that would look cool, and
Yeah.
you incorporate.
Like even when we look at some new games that came out, I don't want to shit talk anybody, but when playing the new Torment game, like you walk around, you see that they just drag and drop certain textures onto maps. And when we started designing like the main square, can I do the trick now? No. Come on, Mac. Do this thing. Yeah, this one. Okay.
Okay, yeah, does it work on backside?
I mean, yeah, we haven't tested it on a Mac, the game, I mean, but so we get all the different payments, but walking around in the city, like city districts don't get financing normally, so you always get something like this. And this, like, they didn't have enough money to continue or fix this sort of mosaic thing here, so they just added a slab of concrete. And if you walk around town here or anywhere else, you see all these really weird mashups of different textures and shapes and things. And because this game is not a fantasy game per se, and it's not a science fiction game, it sort of takes place in a contemporary-like world in the alternative 50s or 60s. Then all the objects have to be sort of recognizable. And oh, it's so nice not to read from the page. So when designing this thing, yeah, when I'm thinking about, I don't know, a street side or something like that, I walk around, take photos with my phone and think about it, and then sketch different things, and also says it's nonsense, let's not do that, and then we try something else.
It's a very rare skill, attention to detail. I mean, that level of attention to detail, as you described, as in looking at the world around you and noticing that, oh yeah, have a good look at the street and go, oh yeah, this is exactly what happened there. Like you said with the payments, like the slab of concrete.
But it's, I'm going to shit talk some more. Certain games, there's like sort of a resurgence of isometric type role-playing games. I mean, Divinity Original Sin is not with pre-rendered backgrounds, and it's not really isometric, but it's top-down sort of dollhouse view of the game. And a lot of those games, they do their Kickstarters and they just start mashing tons and tons and tons of content into that thing. But if the game becomes so big, you have less time to like spend your attention on working out the details. And our game is actually super small. Like it's a tiny area, and although we have a lot of interior maps, like you can, yeah, I'm not gonna try that. You can basically go into most of the buildings that you see in the game, which is again different from a lot of the games that are out there. Like you see a lot of facades, but they try a door and it says it's locked and they don't have a key and they never get in there. But here, that's not the case. Like if it's locked, there's a reason for that, and we can find a key and get in there. And
I have a question that's probably silly because I'm not so smart, but the characters are in 3D, right?
yes.
And how they are textured to blend into the background as well.
Okay.
I saw a bit of video of them.
That's the painted normal maps I spoke about earlier.
Oh.
So normal maps are just this one sort of information that game engine uses to know whether, if the normal map is reversed, my side would be here, would be in shadow, and the light would be behind me from that lamp, for example. But basically what we do is we hand paint them. So it's a computer-generated thing that we then take apart and put back together so that it would have this painterly effect. And that's how we start blending in with the backgrounds. I mean, if you look really closely and zoom in, you'll still see a difference, but it's not as obvious. And this is how we can sort of do all this expressive brushwork that you can see in the background.
How long is the planned gameplay?
No idea.
So you assume
I assume there's like a speedrun version where you can do it in a few hours, but do you mean like if you vacuum everything and do everything in the game?
yeah, if you enjoy it.
Okay. It's a long time. because there are, like, this is not the area of the art department per se, but there are a lot of alternative paths you can take in the game. So you can decide to be one kind of cop, or you can show the video, you can be an art cop. But if you're an art cop, you cannot be another type of cop, sort of. So certain options lock out other paths. So I think there's like tens of hours total.
So you can play it several times.
If you want to. Some people like that, some people hate that. So I guess it depends on, like, one very specific target audience group is these nerds that never leave their room and replay a game 20 times. I've done that with Fallout, for example. Like, there was a period, like 10-year period, where every year I would just put out Fallout, the first one, Fallout 1 game, and just replay it. I know everything in there, but I like the feel. It's nostalgic. It's like I'm 8 years old again, learning how to curse. I mean, it's different. And we're trying to get that same feel in this game as well. That's what I mean about like paying attention to the details. Like, you don't have weird things where, like, the baked-in shadow is this way, but I walk here and I throw a shadow that way. It's going to look weird. Fallout didn't have none of that. It had a lot of annoying things, but like the music and the art direction were wonderful.
Well, again, a bit outside of the art department, but how did you solve the motion capture?
We stopped using it.
Oh.
Yeah, motion capture did weird things, and yeah, that wasn't the way we wanted to go. We just spent so much time cleaning the animations, and it's easier to just hire a very good animator who can, like, sort of build it from ground up.
And you used the capture that didn't work was?
It was like this gaming console thing.
Later on, there are a couple of mechanics.
But why didn't motion capture work? Is it because of the loop or something else?
It was expensive time, hour-wise. Like, it's just
cleanup itself.
Yeah. Like, for our purposes, like, it was easier to sort of shoot reference material on ourselves, send it off to the animator, and get keyframes, and I think that's how we're doing it right now. Like, there's this one guy who does most of the key poses, and then another guy who blends them together. It's like in a big animation studio, but we have to do.
And did you do it in Blender?
No way. That's all mine. In Blender, I use Blender because I don't know how to do 3D. And it's cheap, and it has, it's for free, and it has a lot of tutorials.
So, besides the hidden geometry, everything else is 2D, but
not true. I mean, we have characters that are real time. We have the hidden geometry that's real time. We have particle effects that's real time, and certain lights and things as well. Like in the game, we would have this seawater. In the video with the boat, where the boat shadow was going, you can see water, which is actually a texture of Van Gogh's Starry Sky that we used to get this release for us. It's like really meta art thing. Then we have the water. Water is 3D, and the waves and things. And also we're going to have like birds flying around, and maybe a cat darting into a fence or something like that. And all of this will be 3D.
How long have you been working on this?
A little over 2 years.
How long do you think is left?
I don't know. This is, I mean, my part is almost done, and then I get other assignments and have to sort of restart my art education again. Like it was with this thing, as I said in the beginning, like I draw, like the stuff that's going on here, I was trained for this. And then this guy told me, like, draw a room and a bunch of chairs, and I was just, teaching me how does this work. Game's almost done. You'll see it soon.
How do you draw these pictures? I mean, the workflow, can you draw like on the view, that's the final view, or
You mean in the backgrounds?
Yeah.
That's actually a question for Oslo. but essentially he sets up this humongous Photoshop file where he links in all the different maps and different layers. So he can.
So you still have to paint the texture map, like unfold it, and then get feedback from the other view how it looks in the case.
No, you take the actual final rendered image, and then I think directly on top of that.
Well, we can do that especially because it's isometric and it doesn't move. It's just this flat plane that's only the characters and things move around on top of it. So we can put in like extra information.
So no VOVs.
Yeah.
Which is awesome.
You mentioned that on some occasions this game starts to eat memory or performance. If you look, I tried out the version on Gamescom and I didn't notice anything. But
Yeah, because then we didn't allow you to zoom out that.
yeah, okay. But are you still working on this issue, or have you some ideas how to?
Well, we're limiting, not limiting as in a bad way limiting, but limiting in a good way, like the maximum zoom in and zoom out where the game looks best and where it makes sense. Like there's no point in allowing the player to zoom out of the whole game map world because you can't do anything in that thing. So I guess we're going to optimize that, and the mega textures help that.
Yeah, the mega textures thing essentially completely wiped the problem for us because no matter how far you zoom out, it only streams in as much data as you need.
But you cannot stream like straight too far.
And if you go too far, it starts skipping pixels at least like every 4 pixels a little bit, like a progressively smaller image. And the memory footprint, it never changes essentially, no matter your zoom level. Because the amount of pixels on the screen is always the same.
I ask how this looks like a very strongly story-driven game, and how much the writer and the artists collaborate or
We fight all the time. Like literally fight. I saw one of the writers today and I was surprised that he wasn't angry at me. But no, we collaborate all the time. Are there any extra chairs? No?
Yeah.
No.
I can go back there.
No, I can stand up.
I can go back there.
Really? Thanks so much. What was the question? What was it?
Fighting.
Sorry?
The writers, artists, fighting.
Yeah. Like the process is you get a rough draft of what the area has to be like, then I draw a sketch or a few variations, we send it back, we look it over inside the art department, we send it to the writers department, they send us feedback or tell us to redo the whole thing, we get upset, then we do it again, and then we send it into 3D. Then it gets modeled, and then we send it again to the writers because meanwhile, during that week that it takes to model the whole thing, the writers might have changed their mind. Or sometimes we finish something and a few months later the whole thing has to be changed. So the whole thing gets moved around a lot. There are a few areas in the game that that have been there from the very beginning, like 2 years ago, and look nothing like it. And if you look into the screenshot folder that we have up on Dropbox, you'll see that just things move around and like everything changes. Same thing happens with our shaders and with like the meta material inside the game. Like we use one approach and then we use another approach and we change lighting or we start using meta textures because we can get the frame rate down otherwise. At one point we rendered shadow maps and normal maps out not in full 4K resolution but in 2K resolution. But when we could start streaming that stuff with mega textures, everything can be with higher detail and more expensive. So I think we're running out of time.
Yeah. Thank you.